Well, I'm now joined by James Paterson, the newest Liberal Senator from Victoria and a campaigner for free speech. You heard that interview, James. The case was dropped. Martine Delaney dropped it. Does that mean free speech is then safe and nothing to see here, folks?
Sadly, no, Andrew, it doesn't mean that. It shouldn't have come to this, and it shouldn't have been abandoned just because Ms Delaney decided to not pursue it. First of all, these laws shouldn't exist in the first place, which allow anyone to take this sort of action. But if these laws do exist, the moment a complaint like this is made, the Human Rights Commission, or the relevant Anti-Discrimination Commission in this instance, should have immediately dismissed it as an inappropriate application. But they didn't. They entertained it, and that sent a very scary signal to people who want to participate in the upcoming debate about same-sex marriage in the plebiscite, that they have to be very careful about what they say, or they might end up in the courts.
Well, exactly, because there's a chilling effect. Even though the churches have had this dropped, obviously they had lawyers, the expense. Archbishop Porteous of Hobart wasn't allowed to speak for a while. You think twice. Who wants to be dragged up like that and made an example of?
Exactly, Andrew. The real dangers of these laws is not just the high-profile court cases that we see from time to time, but all the secret conciliations that take place in the Human Rights Commission nationally and in the state anti-discrimination commissions, and all the people who see that and, out of fear, silence themselves. They self-censor because they're worried about what will happen to them.
There's another thing too here, James. This is not the only instance we've seen where people who oppose same-sex marriage are punished. There's free speech. There are attempts to take it away from them or punish them for having exercised an opinion. Are you worried that, I think you're a supporter of same-sex marriage, but are you worried that once it becomes law, that the next move will be to outlaw speech against it?
You're right, Andrew. I do support same-sex marriage because I believe it is an issue of freedom. People should have the freedom to marry each other, whoever they may like. But you don't give freedom to one group of people by taking it away from another. And I'm very concerned the freedom of people who have a religious objection to it or just a conscientious objection to it are going to be taken away if same-sex marriage is legislated. We've seen in the United States bakers and jewellers and florists being sued because they didn't want to participate in a gay wedding, and I would not want to see that happen in Australia, and I wouldn't support any same-sex marriage bill or referendum unless there were sufficient protections for people's religious liberty and their freedom of conscience.
There's very little debate about that, James, though. Here's another case that really troubles me of people being silenced, right? Now, an Aboriginal academic at the Queensland University of Technology is suing students for complaining on Facebook when she kicked them off the Aboriginal-only computers at that university. Now, I would have thought that's discrimination, but no, she complains against them because one of them, for example, called this a form of apartheid, which is true. Should the law be used to stop people from simply expressing their opinions like this?
I don't think it should, Andrew. I mean, as you know, 18C is a terrible law which restricts freedom of speech, and if your case wasn't a good enough example of that, I think this case at QUT is an even more powerful example because it shows that not just a high-profile conservative commentator can be restricted by this, but students venting on Facebook, which is the worst you could say of what they did, can be victims of this. We are all threatened by laws like this. All of our freedoms are in danger unless action is taken to repeal this law.
Yeah, but these are kids that don't have a high-priced company lawyer to support them or anything like that. This is ridiculous. And I must say, you know, we've invited the students here to put their case, but naturally they're too scared to do so because who knows anymore?
I don't blame them, Andrew, and a couple of the kids in that case have already settled the case to avoid the damage to their reputations.
Absolutely.
Why should a student have to pay effectively what is go-away money to not be sued for just expressing themselves? I think that is a scandal and an outrage, and this law has to be addressed.
Well, when is your government going to do this?
Well, in my view, sooner rather than later, I hope. There is a bill by Senator Bob Day, the Family First Senator from South Australia, which will at least amend 18C and reduce the risk that
good
cases
on
like
Bob
this
Day
happen.
from the Family First, but when is your government going to do this? And may I ask, where's the Human Rights Commission been in this?
Well, Bob Day has my support, and I'll be voting for his bill at the earliest opportunity, and I'll be encouraging all my colleagues in the government to do so. I think that the Turnbull government, once it's re-elected, should take up Bob Day's bill as a government bill and push it through, and that's what I'll be arguing for. But you're absolutely right. The Human Rights Commission has again been silent on this issue.
It's supposed to be defending our freedoms, this Human Rights Commission. Freedom of speech is perhaps the most basic of human rights, apart from freedom of life, and it's silent.
Andrew, there was a short golden period at the Human Rights Commission for about 2 years when my friend and former colleague Tim Wilson was there, and he was a really robust advocate for free speech on this and other cases. Unfortunately, both before Tim got there and since he has left, it seems that no one else at the Commission, including the President, has any interest in advocating for freedom of speech.
Well, you mentioned
They're much more interested in pursuing other issues.
Exactly. You mentioned Tim, since he's got Liberal pre-selection down at Goldstein, has been replaced. Now, he's been replaced by this government, right, under a process of this government, by Edward Santow from the Public Interest Advocacy Centre, whose centre actually wants to keep the Racial Discrimination Act, which was used against these students, and doesn't want churches free from anti-discrimination legislation. How can a Liberal government appoint such a person? Is this a joke, as a Freedom Commissioner?
Well, I don't know Mr Santow, and I'm not familiar with his record, but from what I have heard about it, I'm not encouraged. Tim Wilson leaves big shoes to fill, but I'm not sure he's going to come even close to filling those. I hope I'm wrong. I hope he proves me wrong and he takes these issues much more seriously than his previous public comments indicate he might.
Have a Pauline conversion on the way to the Human Rights Commission? I don't think so. But listen, you mentioned that this Human Rights Commission has been virtually silent on this issue, which I think is a scandal. What are we paying this outfit for? The Commission's boss, Gillian Triggs, has got other concerns, apparently. She's gone missing from these battles. But last month, she exercised her own free speech. May I read out some of the things she's called your Liberal colleagues, and in particular ministers, and I presume the Attorney-General was in her sights, George Brandis, quote, cowards, uneducated, seriously ill-informed, people with no education whatsoever about international law, people who don't even understand what democracy is. How can this arrogant woman stay as the impartial head of this Human Rights Commission?
It's a fair question, Andrew. I think that was one of the most breathtakingly inappropriate and political interviews conducted by any public servant I've ever seen. And if Ms Triggs wants to engage in politics, she's welcome to. She could follow Tim Wilson's lead and she could resign from the Commission and seek pre-selection. I'm sure the Greens would welcome her with open arms. But I think while she intends to be an independent, impartial public servant, interviews like that and comments like that are completely inappropriate.
Do you think she should quit?
I think she should. I think she's demonstrated during her time at the Human Rights Commission that she doesn't care about fundamental freedoms and that she is happy to engage in open political and partisan commentary. And I think that's totally inappropriate.
Sheer abuse. No, James Paterson, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Andrew.